Minister of Energy of Peru, who spoke here at the La Jolla conference last year as Minister of Energy. Next to Pedro, David Morris, a professor of political science at UCSD, our neighbor on campus. David's office is right there across the plaza from where we were enjoying cocktails last night. But he also wears another hat as the Baker Energy Scholar at the Energy Scholar at the Baker Institute at Rice in Houston. Well, we're delighted to have these three gentlemen here with us this morning, and what we want to talk about, as the agenda said, is the Western Hemisphere the new global energy capital. And I think we can all agree that when it comes to global energy trends, this is a very interesting development that is occurring in terms of the potential and the ascendancy of oil and gas production in the Western Hemisphere. And one of the things we want to talk about is a Wall Street Journal headline that said, "Move over OPEC, here we come." And I think it's pretty clear, especially after our discussions yesterday and the great opening we had yesterday about the unconventional resource revolution, and I guess what many have referred to as the shale gale, but more specifically the boom in entrepreneurial investment and the technology gains that have basically launched that energy revolution and turned our energy world on its head. And as we talked about yesterday, the boom in natural gas production in the U.S. has not only pushed the U.S. ahead of long-term producers such as Russia, but now put the idea of exports of LNG from the United States, pretty much made that a reality. And for those of you who have been coming to the La Jolla conference, you'll remember it wasn't that long ago that we had maps on the screen that had the ring of import LNG projects. So this really is a major revolution in just a few years. In terms of natural gas and LNG in the United States. And also one of the interesting things here in the United States is what perhaps could be one of the hottest oil plays in North Dakota, with production that now, according to some estimates, is greater than the entire production of Ecuador in terms of daily oil production. And indeed, the U.S., on the backs of some of those major changes, according to PFC Energy, will be the world's largest overall hydrocarbon producer by 2020. But one of the things we want to talk about today is that the U.S. is not alone in this paradigm shift, if you will. And in fact, there's several things rippling across our hemisphere that we want to look at. Massive oil sand production that's targeted to hit something around 5 million barrels per day by 2025. Of course, Brazil's discovery of the deep sea pre-salt and the potential for that production to reach around 5 million barrels per day in the next 8 or 10 years. The gains in Colombia, roughly 1 million barrels per day, with a target of 1.5 million barrels per day by 2020. And of course, as sort of a hemispheric unconventional bookend to Canada, we have Argentina with the Energy Information Administration report noting that Argentina has the largest unconventional reserves in Latin America. So again, with these sort of quick ideas and outline of some of the things that are happening, what we want to do in our discussion this morning is consider this question: is the Western Hemisphere the new global energy capital? And let me throw a couple of questions here, and then we'll get into our conversation. And what I would like to ask Jorge and Pedro and David to talk about is what they see as sort of the most crucial. Well, first of all, do they indeed see this shift of a global energy capital to the Western Hemisphere? And from that point, what do they see as the most critical or most crucial elements for that shift to continue or to fully consummate? Is it this unconventional resource boom? Is it this revolution in the United States and North America? Is Brazil's pre-salt a key element of that? What about production in Venezuela and Mexico? Is that something that has to come back, to rebound for this kind of major shift in geopolitics of energy to the Western Hemisphere to happen? And so within that, one of the things I also want to look at is these all assume major gains in production and major production volumes ramping up. So looking into a bit of a crystal ball, what might be some of the issues that could inhibit those kinds of production gains and affect this kind of long-term or let's say 8 to 10 year outlook? And I guess one of the things is I recently read that somebody said the only issue that would stop this change in the geopolitics is domestic politics. Boy, go figure, huh? So what I want to ask you guys is, if that is the case, where in our hemisphere might that be the most relevant, and is that indeed going to inhibit this idea? And finally, obviously not everyone is convinced of this paradigm shift and of this transfer of geopolitical power to our hemisphere. Some argue that the cost of Middle Eastern production is still much cheaper and going to basically not allow the shift to occur. And plus the idea of competition for these resources, for financial resources, for the finite investment capital that's going to come from Africa and Asia, for example. So those are just some of the ideas. Again, we want to have a conversation, so let me just throw it quickly to Jorge, and we'll maybe go down the line, get some quick thoughts. There are question cards on the table, so don't hesitate to send a question up here, and we'll kick this around for about 45 minutes. Jorge.
I don't think there's a question from anyone that the Western Hemisphere, also Latin America, has the resource base in both conventional and unconventional hydrocarbons to be a new energy capital of the world. The key is the monetization of those resources. A region can be wealthy in resources, but it doesn't have the right tools to monetize those resources, they're poor. And I think that's the challenge that the region faces. You brought up Colombia. The success of Colombia is not necessarily its resource base, it's the policy that Colombia put in place in order to monetize those resources. So you can have a country like Venezuela, you can have a country like Argentina, with huge potential as far as a resource base. But if they don't put on top of the table the rules of the game that will bring 4 key ingredients for the monetization of those resources, they'll never be wealthy. Those are capital. If you look at from the Orinoco to the sands to shale, huge amount of capital, deep water Brazil, huge amount of capital that is going to be needed. Technology. We're going to new frontiers in which technology needs to be there in order for us to really access those resources. Third is operational know-how. You and I can have all the money in the world, Jeremy.
That'd be nice.
And you and I can go and buy the best technology in the world. But if we don't have operational experience on how to apply that technology, we're never going to get where we want to get. Fourth and most important is what I call the stewardship of the enterprise. You can have capital, you can have technology, and you can have operational know-how. But if you don't have an energy plan, if you don't have the fiscal and contractual policies and rules of the game in place to attract the private sector to the table, you will never be able to monetize those resources. So the challenge for Venezuela, the challenge for Argentina, the challenge for Mexico is to really take a look at Colombia and say, what are the rules of the game in Colombia by which both the state, the national oil company, and the private sector, all three of them, can play a very important role in monetizing those resources. I think that's what's missing. That's what's missing in the region. It's not the natural resource base. And Argentina, regrettably, has given us a bad example, to me, of it's not the way to go. So again, it's not resource-based, is what are the rules of the game in order to monetize those resources?
Thank you. Pedro?
I most agree with this approach, but in addition to that, I will review some additional ideas. In terms of regulation, I think regulation could be a roadblock if it's not properly done. In terms of pricing and tax signals to the market, obviously this includes the legitimate environmental and social concerns, which can be a huge issue in Latin America, for instance. And as a matter of fact, it takes months and sometimes years to get permits for drilling, and this can kill projects. Taxation or government take, in any case, for state-owned companies. This probably another issue to be tackled in order to move this idea of getting Western Hemisphere as the new capital of energy. In terms of taxation in the U.S., for instance, this proposal of adding 40 billion taxes on oil or so, it's a major issue to allow or a hindrance to improve drilling. In other cases, in the other countries like Mexico or Venezuela, the funds that are taken out of the industry for the government purposes, probably it's another issue to be dealt with. And in terms of environmental policies, I think in many countries we have all those policies which are being very strict and, in order to allow the activities. There's a nice example about that. In North Dakota, for instance, some companies have been taken to the court because they caused the death of 28 migratory birds in violation of this Migratory Bird Act, which is in some cases seen as an unbalance with what happens with the wind industry, which kills hundreds of or thousands of birds each year. So in terms of renewables, this is seen as another issue. Regarding that, in the US and in some Latin countries as well, the governments are putting a lot of money to the green energy industry, which in the case of the US, it represents only 2.5% of the US energy needs. So yesterday, I think we got a very nice conference about the wind power, for instance, feasible only with natural gas prices below $6 per 1,000 cubic feet. So this is another important thing. And finally, in terms of social uneasiness regarding to extractive industry in most countries, which is in many countries has been supported or even exacerbated by some NGOs, environmental or socially supporting NGOs that are causing a big trouble in getting permits and licenses. Probably, Jeremy, you forgot about this subtitle you added to the presentation, which was dealing with what's happening with the natural gas and LNG in power production in the future. And I have a point here. One of the things that the major change that happened in the energy mix in the world in the last 40 years is basically the electricity production. While the total primary energy has been doubled from 1973 to 2010, electricity production has increased by 220%, which is due to basically to many reasons. And the other thing which is very interesting is basically that in the 70s, almost 20% of the power was produced by oil. And nowadays, this number is only 4%.
Right at the end of your, well, Pedro, I don't know if was there anything else, any final comments?
Yeah, I was trying to say that in terms of LNG contribution, if we can find a synergy between the LNG and these new developments in unconventional natural gas, because probably if we had some clear examples in which natural gas has, through LNG, has reached markets that before they never had the opportunity to use gas, like in the Dominican Republic or Chile, for instance. So in the future, probably the capital costs for regasification facilities or whatsoever are going to continue to decrease. And if we match that with the investment costs for turbines or gas turbines, which, by the way, has become very efficient now, are probably the best way to introduce and increase the usage of natural gas. Just as an example, in my country, Peru, we started using natural gas in 2004. And in the 7 years, nowadays, natural gas accounts something like 30% of our energy source for power production. So in general, I think this is another avenue to increase the usage of natural gas. So I think, obviously, I see the great synergy between those developments in conventional natural gas and the use and the power production in the future.
Thank you. A couple of things here from what you all have said, and one of the things I want to try and bring Jorge and David in on is something Pedro mentioned about environmental and social concerns. Where do those factors play in? I mean, they obviously play in very heavily in certain places, but what role does that? Is that an inhibiting factor, perhaps, in some countries particularly? Maybe Jorge first, and then David.
Well, there's two things. I want to go back also, before I finish, on a comment that Dave made, that I agree with him, but I want to take a different perspective. If we go back to the issue of stewardship of the enterprise, there is no question that whether it is environment, whether it is social issues, both the private sector also has a responsibility. The issue is up to what extent is the responsibility of social and environmental issues part of the private sector or the state. Again, I go back to the rules of the game. We have to be sure that the rules of the game are such that both operators, national oil companies and international oil companies are responsible. We have to be sure that also those countries have the resources to implement those, whether they're social or environmental regulations. I recently came back from Havana, and let me tell you, it would impress you if you read the new environmental regulations that the Cuban government has in place for drilling offshore. Both you and I could take those regulations off the shelf and say, wow, these are fantastic. In fact, most of them literally copy from Bessie and from the BP report. But Cuba doesn't have the resources to implement those regulations. So what good are regulations in the books and on the shelf if the country, the host country, whichever country happens to be, doesn't have the resources in order to implement those regulations? And I think that's where also it's very important not only that the private sector, but also the state enterprises play a role. There's a comment that Dave made as to the challenge that government face, which is the same challenge that private companies face, which is how do you balance short-term profitability with long-term growth? I mean, if you look at a lot of the populist government in Latin America and some of the reactions that those populist governments in Latin America, they're responding to short-term pressures due to macroeconomic situations in the country. And for some reason, oil is always a nice fat cow to go and get your hands into it in order to take care of a political short-term issue and then sacrifice long-term growth of that potential.
But in those short-term, but politically, those pay dividends.
Well, they pay dividends short-term politically, but they do not pay long-term dividends. Let's look at Mexico, for example. Mexico has decided long time ago strategically to concentrate on the Gulf of Campeche and Cantarell. I mean, that was their focus. That was the cow that kept producing milk, and it was fantastic, and they forgot about the rest. Also, you have policies in governments like Mexico and Venezuela that take capital out of the national oil company, and this is not an issue between a national oil company and IOC. They take money out of the national oil company to supplement social programs that the state ought to be funding somewhere else. I remember when Lula came on board, when Lula came and became president of Brazil, many of us wondered, what is going to happen to Petrobras?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we said this is the end of Petrobras, Lula is going to go after it, and that is the total collapse of how we know. It didn't happen. Why? Because Lula said, wait a minute, I'm a major shareholder of the corporation, therefore I'm going to collect dividends. As the shares of Petrobras goes in value, I benefit. Not only that, but I want Petrobras to grow and make money because I also collect taxes and revenues out of Petrobras. And the Petrobras strategy was a long-term strategy. And he didn't touch it. He let it go.
But maybe David will pivot until the pre-salt, at which point there was I don't know if it was touching or if it was, there was a little bit. So let's talk about more about this politics and maybe.
Can we keep politics out of oil?
Does politics play an issue?
You can't keep politics out of oil because everything's politics. I mean, come on. In the United States, the fact that we give the market such a large role in energy is a political decision. It's not that it fell from the sky. It's a political decision. So politics is in everything. The question is, what is it that determines the direction of policy that comes out of politics? Now, I think actually one of the things that helps Brazil is the fact that you have a competitive political system in Brazil, so that the new government that's going to come in doesn't have the confidence that it's going to be there forever. So it has to worry about when it's out of power. When you have that kind of a system, there are lots of political science theories about this. I won't bore you with that kind of stuff. But when you have a system when the group in power, the party in power today, can't be sure that it's going to be in power tomorrow, it doesn't want to concentrate things in the office today. It doesn't want to make it possible for everybody to grab everything, because next cycle it's out of office and it won't get anything. So under these competitive systems, you get policy that is much more geared towards the longer term, because parties come in and cycle in and out. So if you think about the United States, you think about Brazil, that happens.
Colombia.
Think about Colombia. Peru, okay, but then you think about Venezuela and you think about Argentina, and you know, you've got dominant parties. They're going to be there for a long time. They expect to be there for a long time. So they like the idea of concentrating the ability to take those resources. And that's a structural problem. Brazil doesn't have that. Brazil does have the temptation to do something. They've certainly changed the regulations in the pre-salt to increase their take. But as we know from history, you can increase your take up to a point and still have a very profitable industry. And the Brazilian challenge is to stay below that point at which they wind up being much more like Venezuela, where capital's there, but they're not really doing anything except maintaining their presence. Let me go to the environmental question, because I think that's, rather than see it as an obstacle, it's an integral part of developing these resources. We do live in a world in which environmental issues are very important. They're important in Canada, they're important in the United States. So the question is, what kinds of regulations will be adopted? And I think Latin America is facing two major challenges in thinking about how environment's going to impact the development of these resources. The first is that a lot of the environmental impact and implications of the non-conventionals is still unknown. Okay, think about what we just discovered in the United States about if you put your excess water from shale, from fracking, too far down in the ground. All right, you actually generate some earthquakes of a significant magnitude. Four. All right, we didn't know that 2 years ago. We do now know that you can't go too far down. All right, so there's some things that we're just learning. And then there are things that we know, but as Jorge pointed out, the government's got to have the ability to regulate, to implement the regulations. And in Latin America, lots of governments don't have this agency capability. So an investor thinking about investing in non-conventionals in Latin America has to be aware that we don't know what those environmental regulations are for the medium term. Some of them don't exist in the short term. The ones that exist in the short term are likely to be significantly altered as we move forward. And that introduces an element of risk. All right? It's not that environment is an obstacle. Environment has to go hand in hand with the development of the resources. But again, it's a trade-off. And unfortunately, in Latin America, both the science and the development of the industry are far too early for us to know what in fact is the medium-term profile of environmental regulations on the non-conventionals.
Thanks. You know, I think, Pedro, I want you to, no, it's great. That's great. Let's take a couple of these things we've just been talking about, because I think Peru is a great place to drill down on these things. You've had a change in government. You've had some of these things we've talked about, which is a change in a fairly important shift in power between two different governments. You had somebody who had been in opposition and made lots of statements about how they would manage natural resource economy. You have a major natural resource investment decision that seems to be hanging in the balance based upon environmental and social issues. So sort of wrapping all of these things together, talk a little bit about Peru and how these issues are being dealt with. How does the Humala government, now that it's in power, manage these issues sort of from the other side of the table and keep that economic train heading down the tracks, which is so important?
I think in terms of basically economic growth and for developing any other resources, Peru has in the last 20 years maintained a stable regulatory framework and great respect for the agreements that the country entered with investors. Probably that was the basis for all these things. And something I would like to point in terms of growth, for instance, we got in the period 2000-2011, by far Peru is the country which with the highest economic growth. And one of the areas in which we got the support is basically natural gas. And in natural gas development came in a time in which countries started to grow, and we had bottlenecks at that time because of investment in power generation was a serious issue in 2004. And at that time, when we got the natural gas, it just helped us to have nowadays probably one of the most competitive power sectors in Latin America. Our energy prices are very competitive in the long term, not only in the short term. So that's, and we could manage that because just after we got the natural gas and the LNG export, we entered into a big discussion in the country, and someone told me more or less the same discussion that's going on in the US because of exporting gas. Because it's not fair for the country to export something to your competitor because they will be able to produce with a reduced cost. So that's not fair. So we, at that point, the government, the opposition party, which is government today, was supporting very heavily to break the contract, to breach the contract with this for the export project. And it was very tough for us to maintain those policies for that period. At the end, we came with a very positive agreement in which instead of just breaching the contract, we agreed to increase capacity in order to supply the internal market. So probably that's something I would think was a test for this development project in Peru. And so I think consistently, if we see our neighbors in many of those, we did basically the same reforms in the 90s, but we were able to maintain, and that probably explains that growth I was mentioning now. So the big issue that in some ways David has mentioned about how to transfer those benefits to the common people, probably that's the big challenge. And in some cases, it's difficult. But in Peru, we have committed to economic growth, and the results are very nice, because in the last 5 years, we came from a very strong number in poverty reduction. We went from 48 to 30%. So, and that's probably the more consistent way to address the poverty reduction, growth, economic growth. So if we put all these things together, I would think that consistent policies, respect to stability and stability of the rules of the game, as Jorge mentioned, probably is the way to go.
Thank you. You know, it struck me as Pedro was talking, because one of the things he was talking about is sort of an infrastructure issue, and I think it was last night Manuel Colcombet talked about what it took to do the Peru, basically the Camisea project and some of the logistical elements to get that infrastructure developed. And I don't think we really heard anything yet this morning about infrastructure. And Jorge, you talked about, sort of you held up Colombia as a great example, as many agree it is, in terms of recuperating production and pushing up to a goal of significant magnitude. But where does infrastructure start to come into that? And I think it's already in the equation. So that's Colombia, but I think, as we start to push into these frontiers where you don't have perhaps the necessary infrastructure, let's talk a little bit about infrastructure.
I think it's getting there. I think Chile is a good example, for example, in the way they went into building the LNG plants. I think you have Colombia. I think you have a number of companies, independent companies in Brazil, also going into the infrastructure sector. There's no question that if you look at the value chain, the monetization value chain of hydrocarbon, particularly midstream business, there's a considerable need for infrastructure. And that is a role that large independents have a huge contribution to make. You always think of the Shells and the Exxons and the Conocos, but there's a large number of petroleum companies, equipment and service companies that play a very huge role in the industry. And we also have to make sure that the rules of the game apply to them in that area. One, talking about infrastructure, is the role that, for example, China is playing in infrastructure development, which, by the way, is a total new competitor in the field that international oil companies have to face. Whether it's Sinopec or CNOC or any of the three major China oil companies come to the table, they come to the table with an advantage, a business advantage that very few companies have, and that is that they have the support of the state bank. So from a financial point of view, they can put money on the table, considerable amount of money is on the table. And they mostly...
As they have done in Venezuela.
That they have done in Venezuela, in Brazil, in Ecuador, and a number of other places. And also they bring infrastructure connections with them. In other words, if you deal with the Chinese, most likely, they will also offer to you a construction company. They will offer to you technical advice. So they are a full package, turnkey type of offer that for a lot of these governments, particularly on the financing capital side, is very hard to turn down. But in other words, yes, infrastructure is needed. You look at Colombia now trying to expand and build a pipeline to the Pacific. That, again, becomes part of that long-term view, diversification into the future, that you cannot depend on one single market. You have to think about different markets, and certainly infrastructure plays a role. The petrochemical side of the business, if you look at some folks are saying, well, if gas or liquids cannot come to us, we'll take the petrochemical business to where the gas is. So it's no longer just the major oil companies. We're now talking about petrochemical enterprises, you're talking about the electric power sector, and you're talking about the large independent construction companies that really play a very important role in developing that infrastructure that is needed.
Pedro, why don't you make a couple comments and then we'll go to...
I think in terms of future and perspective, we see ourselves as Peru as an energy exporter. And we have, I think, the basis for that because we have a lot of hydropower resources, wind power, natural gas. But what are we doing for that? In general, we created a large infrastructure basis. We are constructing a 500 kV line, which ties the northern to the southern region of the country, which is going to be a key factor once the interconnection with our neighbors like Chile or Brazil will occur in the future. And that's consistent with our energy policy, in which the increase in our energy production or energy capacity is a key issue. And basically, and that's probably the unique case of Peru, based on private investment. We were able to develop all those facilities, all the infrastructure, basically with private investment. So the government is more committed just to invest in areas in which the private sector is not going to be present, like rural electrification or in general for social issues. So that's probably our shape, and this is going to, it's allowing us to think of petrochemical industry, and in order to provide value added to our exports.
Great. David, any thoughts on infrastructure as we consider some of these elements?
Yeah, infrastructure is probably the biggest challenge for the region, because infrastructure cuts across whatever national development strategy a government has. If you've got a policy that's not going to develop your resources, you're going to need to import, and import means developing infrastructure. One of Mexico's challenge is how do you get all of this gas around the country, given that the gas pipeline system is very underdeveloped. So whether you're producing it in Burgos or you're importing it through your LNG things, you've got huge infrastructure challenges there. Both Bolivia and Peru have made major investments in domestic infrastructure to gasify the national economy, because they have gas and they want to use that gas domestically. Infrastructure to get the gas out. Brazil's going to face this in the case of the pre-salt fields. They're going to get associated gas, and they're going to have to do something with that associated gas. And that means investments in infrastructure. That means that the government's got to bring partners in, because the challenge is far too big for any government to do the infrastructure on its own. But again, like all of the other investment decisions, those infrastructure decisions are going to have to take into consideration how do you bring the benefits of infrastructure development to a much broader group in Latin America today. Let me end with just the comment, don't think of politics as something that gets in the way. Think of politics as something that is integral to anything you're going to do there. And the question is, how do you get good policies out of the political process? Not how do you marginalize the political process. You can't marginalize it. You can maybe push it to where it doesn't really express itself. But we live in a world in which, because of communication, because of democracy, because of all of these things, people are empowered. And you push it off to a corner, it's going to come right back and pop up and bite you in the face. So politics is there. How do we deal with politics to get better policies?
Spoken like a true political scientist. Thank you. Well, and it's a perfect segue. We're going to wrap up with one final question. We're going to run out of time quickly. So what you've just said leads me directly to this question. Has Norway mastered the best balance of long-term energy investment and using wealth for its society? I think this sort of wraps everything up into what we've been talking about. Jorge.
Yeah, but Norway had an advantage. Norway already had a mature political system. Norway already had a highly educated society. And they had a society already that knew what long-term growth meant from a societal point of view. The challenge that we face in our region is that we have huge short-term issues, poverty, education, that we have to somehow find a solution. That's what Norway did not have. Yes, the Norwegian model, if you take the model in Alaska, in which lots of those resources are put aside for future generations to enjoy when the resources are no longer there, are fantastic. But the problem is that our countries regrettably face today a short-term crisis that Norway did not have at the time. That's the challenge that we face, the private sector and the public sector.
Pedro, Norway?
Yeah, I like the Norway model more than the Alaska Fund, for instance, because they were able to put in place such a policy and to maintain it for such a long time. But I don't think it's easy to try to apply that in a country with a big number of people in poverty or with a lack of infrastructure whatsoever. So in the short term, more likely we are going to continue on trying to use the revenues coming from extractive industries to create infrastructure, basically, and by doing so, probably addressing the poverty issues.
David, Norway.
Norway. Well, we could compare Norway with the United States, right? We have a mature political structure. We can't put any money aside for the long term, right? And we don't have the problems that Latin America has in infrastructure and poverty and whatnot. Norway is really interesting, but I don't think that it's a model for anybody because, you know, unique is an overused word. It can't be overused because unique means one only. But Norway is almost unique. If you think about 5 million people, way up there in the middle of nowhere, right? Now,
Well,
on the other hand,
It depends.
way up there in the middle of nowhere, huh?
I've never been. So. But on the other hand, you
Leif
know,
Erikson, huh? Come on.
I have to say that I'm impressed that Morales has been able to resist a lot of temptations. He runs a tight financial ship. Morales is not Chavez. He's not spending, you know, money like crazy and borrowing money and whatnot. Now, Morales' national strategy is not mine. But what that demonstrates is that it is possible for a government, even a government that is dedicated to doing something very different with their natural resources, it is possible for a government to make decisions that constrain the killing the golden goose or milking the cow too much, whatever analogy you want to use. And I think that's encouraging.
It certainly makes wanting to be the finance minister of Norway one of the most desirable jobs in the world, I believe, right? Look, thank you all very much. I want to end with a final question, yes or no, and I think we've gotten your answers, but let's just get it very explicitly. Adios to OPEC, David?
No.
Pedro?
What was the question?
Adios to OPEC, so long geopolitical dominance of the Middle East?
I think yes.
Yes?
No. But that's not OPEC. OPEC isn't the geopolitical dominance of the Middle East.
Okay.
Venezuela helped create OPEC.
All right.
I'm still there.
I'm trying to wrap the panel up here. It's a one word.
No.
No. Thank you very much. We're going to resume in 15 minutes over here.